So I want to start with a question that almost no buyer of clinical AI in this country has been asked directly. Here it is. The last AI tool you started using, the one your group bought last quarter, or the one bundled into the EHR upgrade, the one your hospital pirated on your unit, the one your investor portfolio company is selling to the health system you advise. Was it cleared by the FDA as a medical device? See, most of you don't even know the answer to that. And that's not a criticism. The product probably did not tell you. Well, vendors pitched it. Almost certainly did not lead with it. It was in there somewhere, maybe. And the trainer who walked you and your team through the workflow definitely didn't bring it up. The procurement committee that approved the contract may not have known to ask, but the answer matters because if a tool is a medical device under FDA regulations, the rules that govern it, what it can claim, how it has to perform, and what happens when it fails, who's liable when something goes wrong, and what evidence the manufacturer had to produce before it reached your practice are categorically very different from the rules that govern most software in your stack. So this is the Clinical Realist. I'm Dr. Sarah Mapp on location here at a rest stop. Amazing. So today we're going to walk through these questions. Every clinician, every health system buyer, and every health tech founder in the audience needs to be able to answer cleanly. How do you tell when an algorithm is a medical device? What do the three FDA approvals pathways actually mean about the evidence behind a product? And what does professional liability look like when the device is the one making the call? So this episode pairs directly with this week's conversation on medical economics. There, I argued that most healthcare AI fails on financial grounds because the user, the decider, and the payer are three different people with three different incentives. Today, we're adding a fourth seat to that table, the regulators. And the regulators' answer to the question of whether your AI is a device shapes everything the other three are operating from. So let's start. The FDA defines a medical device very broadly. The statutory language has been in place since 1976 in the medical device amendments. So a medical device is any instrument, apparatus, or other article intended for the use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, or intended to affect the structure or function of the body. Wow, that's a big one. So that definition is older than most of the technology used and maybe older than us. And it's been doing double duty in the AI era. So when the FDA looks at an AI tool, the question is not, is this software? Software is everywhere. The question is, what is this software claiming to do? If the tool is making a diagnosis, supporting a diagnosis, recommending a treatment, predicting an outcome that drives a clinical decision, or alerting on a clinical condition, it's functioning as a medical device. So the official regulatory category is software as a medical device, or SAMD. Now, first of all, I'm going to put out there, I am not a lawyer nor a regulator, so no matter what, you always have to check. In the meantime, though, let's see if we can make sure we all understand this a little bit better. So 3 quick examples to make this concrete. Example 1. So say you have an AI tool that reads a retinal image and tells you that the patient has signs of diabetic retinopathy. That's a medical device. It's making a diagnosis. The FDA has cleared at least one product in this category, IDX-DR, and the clearance process took years. Now, example 2, an AI tool that monitors your charting and suggests an alternative diagnosis you might consider. That could be a medical device too. It's supporting a diagnosis. The clearance pathway depends on what the tool claims to detect and how confident the manufacturer is willing to be in writing. Example 3, an AI scribe that listens to your visit and drafts your note. Is that a medical device? Probably not. Again, and this is currently positioned by most vendors. The scribe is drafting documentation, but it's not making or supporting a clinical decision. So the FDA has signaled that ambient documentation tools really sit outside the medical device pathway as long as the physician is the one signing them. But, and this is the part most procurement teams miss, that boundary is not stable. The moment that ambient scribes start suggesting a billing code or surfacing a clinical alert or flagging a possible diagnosis you didn't consider, it may have crossed the line. So the tool you bought last quarter as a documentation aid might actually be performing as a clinical decision support. And clinical decision support, depending on how the manufacturer markets it, may or may not need FDA clearance. So this is also where the 21st Century Cures Act starts to matter. So Cures, passed in 2016, carved out certain clinical decision support tools from FDA oversight under very specific conditions. One of the central conditions, the physician has to be able to independently review the basis for recommendation. If the AI is a black box and the doc can't see the reasoning, exemption may not apply. If the AI starts to see recommendation with clear logic that the system can independently evaluate, it might be exempt. So the line's drawn on transparency, not on the underlying technology. So for the clinicians in the audience, the practical takeaway is short. Ask the question. Ask that question of every AI tool in your workflow. Is this a medical device? If the vendor can't answer or the answer is we are exempt, ask them to point you to the specific exemption they are releasing. For the health tech founders in the audience, the same question applies in reverse. So you should be able to answer it clearly and cleanly. Your customers are going to start asking. The buyers who get good at this are going to drive procurement standards across the industry inside the next 18 months. And for the health system procurement teams in the audience, the failure mode is uniform. Most AI vendors' due diligence today still leads with security and data handling, and those are necessary. They're not necessarily sufficient, though. The regulatory status of the product belongs in the first 10 questions of the procurement conversation. And if it's not there in your process, that's a process gap to close. So you don't need to become a regulatory expert to operate well in this environment. What you need to know is that you need to know enough to push the question, and you need the discipline to push it on every contract. And once a tool is classified as a medical device, the FDA evaluates it through one of three primary pathways. And each pathway means something very different about how rigorously the tool was tested before it reached your practice. Now, remember, just because it's cleared by the FDA doesn't mean it's going to improve clinical outcomes. It doesn't mean it's going to be ready for your workflow. It just means it's cleared from a regulatory perspective. So the audience for this episode, clinicians, buyers, founders, should know how to read these. First is pathway one, 510K clearance. And this is the most common pathway. It's also the one that people misunderstand. It's not the same as approval. A 510K means the manufacturer demonstrated the device is substantially equivalent to a predicate device, one that's already on the market. And a bar is comparison, not safety and efficacy in the trial sense that we usually associate with the FDA approval. So for AI tools, the 510K pathway is currently the most common route, and it's faster than the alternatives, often 6 to 9 months if you're lucky. The trade-off is that the evidence the FDA reviewed before clearance might be relatively limited. So if you see a press release that says a clinical AI tool is FDA cleared and you don't see any other qualifier, that almost means always it is a 510K. So translate that as the manufacturer demonstrated similarity to something else the FDA has previously seen. Doesn't mean the tool was studied in a large multi-site clinical trial. So this is also where the most common procurement misread happens. The phrase FDA cleared gets used in decks all the time as if it means the same thing as FDA approved. And it really doesn't. A health system that does not know the difference is going to make different decisions than one that does. So the good news is the difference is easy to teach. The bad news is that most procurement teams have not been taught. Now, what is pathway two? Well, this is de novo. And the de novo pathway is for novel, lower to moderate risk devices that don't have a predicate to compare against. And many of the early AI tools that the FDA cleared, including the ones for diabetic retinopathy detection that I mentioned earlier, went through de novo. And de novo process requires the manufacturer to make a risk-based case from scratch and to commit to specific performance characteristics. So it's a lot more rigorous than 510K and establishes a new device type that subsequent products can then use as a predicate. Now, the de novo pathway is the one to look for if you're evaluating a tool in a clinical area that did not exist as a device category before AI. The clearance letter usually contains performance specifications. And this is information you can ask the vendor to share. Ask for it. The letter is a public document. If they aren't going to provide it, well, that itself is a signal worth waiting. And then there's pathway three, pre-market approval, PMA. So this is the most stringent pathway. PMA is required for class 3 devices, the highest risk category. PMA requires clinical trial evidence. So it's what most physicians have in mind when they think of FDA approval. But very few AI tools are currently going through PMA because most are positioned as class 2 or lower risk class 3. So if a tool you're evaluating cleared PMA, you can ask for the trial data and it exists by regulatory requirement. So the takeaway from this is very short. When a vendor tells you their AI tool is FDA cleared, ask which pathway. The answer will tell you what kind of evidence the FDA reviewed. And remember, 510K is a floor, de novo is more substantial, and PMA is the gold standard. But none of them is a guarantee that the tools can perform well on your specific patient population. But all three give you a starting point to evaluate the depth of the regulatory review behind the product. Now, for the founders in the audience, the pathway you choose at submission time is a signaling decision. Substantially equivalent claims are fast and easy to underwrite, harder to defend in sophisticated procurement room. A de novo or PMA track product carries a much higher cost, and a longer timeline and substantially harder evidence on the back end. So the right answer really depends on the buyer you're selling to and the bar the buyer is going to hold you to. Now, if the buyer's sophisticated, lead with the most rigorous pathway you can credibly support. The shortcut is more expensive than it looks. So now we get to the question that almost nobody is talking about in the AI procurement meeting: liability. The standard of care in medicine is what a reasonable physician with similar training experience would do under similar circumstances. And this is the framework that governs malpractice cases. It's also what your insurer is underwriting against. And it was designed way before any clinical workflow involved a black box algorithm. So there's three liability questions every provider using an AI tool should be able to answer. And there are also three parallel questions every health system procurement team should be able to answer about every AI tool they're solving for. I'm going to walk through all three from both angles. So question one, if the AI gets it wrong, who's responsible? You, the manufacturer, or both? Now, the current legal answer in most jurisdictions is it really depends on whether you reasonably relied on the tool and whether the tool was being used as the manufacturer. If you used the tool off label, though, or if you ignored a clinical signal that contraindicated the AI output, the picture gets hard. The standard of care does not vanish because an algo got involved. It just gets harder to articulate. Now, on the procurement side, does the vendor identify the health system in the event of an AI driven adverse event and under what conditions? Now, almost every AI vendor contract I've read in the last 12 months tries to push that liability back onto the practicing institution. And some of it's very reasonable, but some of it may not be. So the clauses to look for are the indemnification scope, the cap on vendor liability, and the exceptions list. Now, the exceptions list is usually where the operative risk lies. Now, question two, when the algo updates, are you using a different device? Now, this one's unique to AI because most medical devices are static. A defibrillator does not get smarter over time. Many AI tools do. So the FDA has issued guidance on what it calls predetermined change control, which allows manufacturers to update certain device parameters without triggering a brand new clearance. Updated software can mean meaningfully different performance. And if the AI you trusted 6 months ago has been retrained, maybe on new data, your reliance on its output is reliant on a different model. So the vendor should be able to tell you when the model is off updated. And if they can't, that's a question worth raising. The procurement side version of this is, does the contract require the vendor to notify the health system of material model updates? Does it give the health system any right to evaluate performance on the new model before it goes live? Now, a lot of contracts don't carry that clause by default, and not a lot of procurement teams are asking for it. And that's probably a gap you should definitely look into. Then there's question three. What did the AI actually see, and can you reconstruct its reasoning? So if you ever face a malpractice action involving an AI-assisted decision, you're going to be asked what information AI had access to, what its output was, and why you acted on it. And if the tool does not produce an audit trail, you may be not able to answer those questions. Some AI vendors maintain detailed logs of every input and output. Others don't. The data retention policy would be in the contract. So read it before something goes wrong, not after. And on the procurement side, does the contract require the vendor to retain inference logs at a level of detail your legal team can actually use in deposition for the duration of your statute of limitations exposure? Now, most contracts will probably retain logs for 90 or 180 days. However, most state malpractice statutes of limitations are 2 to 7 years. So the mismatch could be very structural. The cure is in the contract memo. So I'm not telling you any of this to scare you off of using clinical AI. Used well, these tools are saving lives. And the diagnostic AI that identifies a melanoma you would have missed is an unambiguous patient benefit. A triage tool that flags a sepsis case 6 hours earlier is a clinical win. And AI in clinical practice is here. It's going to expand, and the institutions that learn how to use it well with the regulatory and liability scaffolding in place are going to deliver much better care to more patients while maintaining and managing the downside. What I am telling you is that because the regulatory and liability environment is moving faster than the average procurement conversation, clinicians, leaders, et cetera, are being handed AI tools and asked to use them. And health systems are being asked to sign 3-year contracts on products whose model versions are going to change inside that contract life, maybe a whole bunch of times. Founders who are building are being asked to define their evidence base to procurement teams that are getting more and more sophisticated every quarter. And the conversations about FDA status, model versioning, audit trails, and standards of care are happening in legal offices, not necessarily in exam rooms or boardrooms. And they should be happening in all three. So I'm going to close with the operational layer. 3 asks for each of the 3 seats at this table. If you're a clinician using AI tools in your practice this week, Ask your vendor whether the tool is regulated as a medical device. If they say yes, switch pathway. Each tells you something different about the evidence behind the tool. If they say no, we'll ask them to point you to the specific exemption they're relying on. Write it down. And if a question ever comes up about a clinical decision the tool informed, you will want that documentation. Now, if you're a health system procurement leader, open your 3 largest AI contracts, the active ones, this week. Read the indemnification, model versioning, and audit log retention clauses. Compare the audit log retention period to your state statute of limitations. And if there's a gap, document document it and route it back to the vendor for renegotiation of the next renewal. If you don't have a renewal coming up soon, document the gap and route to your legal team and your insurance broker. The risk doesn't vanish because the contract doesn't address it. Now, if you're a health tech founder selling a clinical AI product, the procurement teams you are selling to are about to get really good at this. Now, buyers who learn the questions in this episode are going to drive this standard across the industry inside the next 18 months. So if your product can't answer cleanly, you're going to lose deals you would have won 6 months ago. The fix is really straightforward. Write a one-page regulatory posture. Make sure you name your FDA pathway. Make sure your model versioning policy is clear and your audit log retention is also documented. And remember, you're going to want to negotiate indemnification posture. When you have a really hot prospect, make sure they have it. We have first procurement conversation. The deals are going to be tons faster and you're going to sleep a lot better. Now, if you're an investor sitting on the board of a health AI company, ask to follow these questions at your next board meeting. If the answers are not crisp, it's your data point. The valuation premium for clean regulatory posture is going to widen substantially this year. So help your portfolio company close the gap before the next round. So I want to bring this back to the question I started with. The last AI tool you started using, was it cleared by the FDA as a medical device? Most of you still don't know the answer. But after this episode, you should know what to find, how to find it, and what the answer tells you, and what the follow-up question should be. That's the goal. So clinical AI is not slowing down. The regulatory environment is going to keep moving. The liability frameworks are going to keep evolving. And the institutions and the founders who treat this question as foundational, not optional, are going to define how this technology gets deployed in the next decade. You absolutely don't need to be a regulatory expert, but you need to be regulatorily literate. There's a big difference. So if this episode gave you a framework, share it with somebody in your organization who needs it. If you're working through a specific clinical AI deployment or a specific procurement decision, you want a thought partner who has sat in every seat at this table, my link is in the show notes. And I'll see you next Wednesday. Thanks for joining the Clinical Realist.